I was working at a call center when I was about a year out of college. The job didn't require a degree, so it made college seem kind of worthless. I took it because rent was cheap in that area, so I could afford a decent place even on a crappy job. My building was behind a strip mall near a busy street, and the highway was just past that. The place always smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee ever since I moved in, and it never went away. My shifts at work ended at 10 every night, and the parking lot was poorly lit and mostly empty by then. There were a few people that I started to get to know from work. Cam was one of them, and he was around my age. He started walking me to my car after the first few weeks. He said it was for my safety, but I told him he didn't have to do it. He insisted every time, and acted like it was no big deal. He was quiet and awkward, but not aggressive. He had sandy hair that always looked slightly damp, and he wore the same gray hoodie at least 3 nights a week. He talked about podcasts and obscure documentaries, but I wasn't that interested in any of it. He also talked about his cat that he said did tricks. That actually sounded pretty cool, I can't lie. It was fine at first because he kept a respectful distance, and other coworkers said he was just socially awkward. He never touched me, and he never tried to flirt. He just walked beside me and asked if I made it home okay the next day. I kept my answers short and polite so the routine wouldn't turn into something else. After a few weeks, some details started to feel off. He remembered the exact model of my car and the side street I sometimes used to avoid traffic. He mentioned a grocery store I liked, even though I never told him about it. Then one night, I noticed that my rear bumper looked slightly different under the parking lot light. I leaned down and saw a small black box tucked close to the frame. It was secured with a magnet and thin wire. I stared at it for a long time before pulling it loose and holding it in my hand. I was feeling kind of paranoid, and I thought it was some kind of tracker. I drove home and checked the rest of my car with a flashlight. I didn't find anything else, but that didn't make me feel better. I searched online and confirmed that it was a GPS tracker. I sat at my kitchen table and tried to think through who could have put it there. I called the cops to report it, and they took the device from me. When the officer asked if I knew who put it there, my mind went to Cam, because I didn't know anybody else that might have done it. I didn't have any proof, so they didn't do anything about it right away, and all I could do was wait. The next afternoon at work, Cam talked to me like everything was normal. He smiled and asked if I had a good night. I was nervous around him, and I didn't want to let him know that I found it. I spent the rest of the evening answering calls, and my attention kept drifting. I watched him through the corner of my eye, and I felt a chill every time we made eye contact. When it was time to clock out, he stood up and waited for me by the exit, like he always did. I didn't want to go with him, so I talked to one of my other coworkers to walk with me. His name was Jason, and he was an older guy in his 40s, who I trusted a lot more. As I was leaving with Jason, Cam came from behind and followed us to the parking lot. I tried to speed up, but he caught up and cut us off before we could get to my car. Jason and I stood there looking at Cam as he tried to catch his breath. I hadn't told Jason what he did, so he was probably pretty confused. Cam just stood there like he was expecting me to say something, but I just wanted to leave. The only reason I didn't push past him was that I was scared he would get mad. Eventually, Jason tried to go around, and I followed him, but then Cam kept following to my car. When we got there, he wouldn't leave me alone, and I could tell that Jason was getting confused. Out of frustration, I blurted out to Jason that Cam put the tracker on my car. He clearly heard me, and he admitted it right there. There was no embarrassment and no apology. He even looked relieved that the subject was finally out in the open. Out of fear, I decided I needed to stay calm and agreeable. I smiled slightly and told him it was okay. Then he turned around and walked away. Jason eventually left, and I drove home. When I reached my apartment, I didn't go inside right away, but when I was sure that I hadn't been followed, I carefully got out and went into my building. I called the cops that night to give an update, and I told them that he admitted to planting the tracker. The next morning, they searched his apartment, and they told me what they found. On his computer were photos of me walking to my car, unlocking my door, and buying groceries. Some were taken from across the street, and some were taken closer than I wanted to think about. There was also a drafted letter that described how we were meant to be together, and how fate had guided him to protect me. He was arrested for stalking and illegal tracking. The company placed him on immediate suspension, pending the investigation. Human Resources called me and said they were cooperating fully with law enforcement. They offered to move my schedule and provide security at the entrance for the rest of the week. I took 2 days off and stayed with a friend. I changed my routine and hardly went out the entire time. The police kept me updated and confirmed he would not be released without conditions. They told me he admitted to everything, but he didn't think any of it was wrong or illegal. When I went back to work, his desk was already cleared. People acted weird around me for a while. Within a week, the company officially terminated him for violating workplace policies and endangering an employee. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Cam's attorney arranged a plea agreement. He pled guilty to stalking and unlawful tracking. The judge issued a full restraining order that covered my home, workplace, and any place I regularly visited. He was sentenced to probation, mandatory counseling, and community service. If he violated the order, he would face jail time. Several months later, I received an update confirming Cam had remained compliant with the restraining order. He moved out of the area and found work elsewhere. The officer said there had been no further incidents and no attempts to contact me. That was good to hear, but it was a long time before I felt truly safe again. My name's Claire, and I lived in a building for a few years in the early 2000s. I just started a new job downtown, and the commute from my old place had been wearing me down. The building was a narrow 3-story walk-up with beige siding and metal railings that had chipped paint. I lived on the second floor, and my unit faced a small courtyard with patchy grass, a few crooked patio chairs, and a single streetlight on the other side of the fence. From my balcony, I could see the side entrance and a row of windows from the lower units. The balcony railing felt solid, but I noticed right away that it wasn't that high off the ground. I remember thinking that I could jump down if there was a fire, even though I hoped it would never come to that. Most of my neighbors kept to themselves, and I was no different. I worked long hours, so my routine was simple. I'd come home, drop my bag by the door, and make something easy for dinner. One evening, I was struggling with 2 overstuffed grocery bags that were cutting into my fingers. A guy from downstairs came up to me and offered to help. He had short brown hair that always looked slightly unwashed, and he spoke softly without making much eye contact. He introduced himself as Mark and took one of the bags from me. I thanked him and thought that would be the end of it. The next time I came home with groceries, he was already waiting by the entrance. He smiled in a stiff way and said he'd give me a hand again. I didn't want to seem rude, so I agreed. It slowly became routine without me really encouraging it. He started appearing whenever I returned from shopping, even when the timing felt too perfect to be coincidence. A few days later, I found a folded note tucked under my door. It said, "Glad to help you again today." I felt conflicted because the message seemed harmless, but it also felt like he might be flirting. I didn't respond, and I hoped he would get the hint, but more kept coming. They were always short and polite, but they made me uncomfortable. I appreciated the help on a surface level, but I didn't want it to cross a boundary. I tried to avoid him for a while, but Mark still found reasons to talk to me in the hallway. He asked where I worked and what time I usually finished. I gave vague answers and tried to keep the conversation short. I noticed that he'd linger by the mailboxes when I came home and watch me more than I'd like. One night at around 10, I came home later than usual after staying out with friends. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, and something felt weird. The air smelled faintly damp, like wet soil. I noticed right away that the balcony door was open, even though I thought it was closed. When I turned on the bedroom light, I saw faint muddy footprints leading from my balcony door across the carpet and towards my bed. I knew right away that someone had been inside. The footprints were clear enough to show the pattern of a worn sneaker. The mud had dried slightly and left a dull brown outline against the light carpet. I checked the rest of the apartment carefully and made sure no one was still inside. The windows were closed, and the front door had no sign of damage. The only explanation was the balcony door. I called my landlord right away. He was a middle-aged man named Trevor who lived 2 blocks over and managed a handful of small properties. He answered in a groggy voice and told me he'd come by in the morning. I didn't feel safe enough to wait that long, so I pressed the issue. He agreed to review the exterior cameras first thing and promised to call me as soon as he had more information. I barely slept that night, and I kept my phone beside me just in case I needed to call the cops. The next day, Trevor called and told me what he'd seen on the footage. A man had climbed up onto my balcony from the courtyard around 3 p.m. and slipped inside. He knew that it was Mark because Trevor and Mark would see each other around occasionally. He said the grainy image still showed enough detail to confirm it was him. Trevor called the property company and arranged for Mark to be evicted for violating safety rules and trespassing. The police were also called, and I was guided through the process of filing a formal complaint. An officer came by to take photos of the footprints and examine the balcony. A few days later, Mark showed up at my door before his move-out date. He looked disheveled and more agitated than usual. His eyes darted between the floor and my face, and his jaw was clenched tight. He said I'd hurt him after everything he'd done for me. He talked about how he only wanted to make sure I was safe. He was obviously trying to make me feel bad, but it didn't work. That creep broke into my apartment, and he wanted me to feel sorry for him. It was crazy. Later that week, I was served a copy of the restraining order confirmation. The document said that Mark was legally required to stay away from me and the property. Trevor followed up to confirm that Mark had moved out and that the locks would be changed. They also installed additional lighting in the courtyard and adjusted the angle of the cameras. He also added a stronger lock to the balcony door and double-checked all the window latches. I appreciated the effort, and it really helped. A few weeks later, I saw a new tenant moving into the unit below mine. She was around my age and introduced herself as Carla. She mentioned that she worked as a dental assistant and kept early hours. Talking with her felt normal and casual, which was a welcome change. We ended up having small conversations in the hallway and sometimes waved from our balconies when the weather was decent. One evening, Carla and I sat outside for a while and chatted about the building and the neighborhood. She said she felt comfortable there and liked how peaceful it usually was. I agreed and kept the conversation light. I didn't feel the need to bring up the previous incident. It felt better to let it go instead of constantly reliving what happened. I still live in that same apartment, although I've thought about moving a few times. It's a great place overall, but part of me wishes it was a few floors higher, just to keep the crazies out completely. This happened about 5 years ago, and I was 27 at the time. I worked long shifts at a dental clinic, and I usually didn't feel like cooking anything complicated. After a long day, I went to the grocery store to get something easy. I stood in the prepared food aisle, trying to decide between pasta salad and a rotisserie chicken. The store was quiet, and the staff already looked tired. That was when a guy came over to me. He said his name was Arnold, and he started talking to me. He said he lived nearby and came in around the same time every week. He had neat brown hair and a clean button-down shirt that looked ironed. He smiled a lot and maintained strong eye contact. We talked while walking to the checkout, and the conversation felt easy at first. He asked what I did for work and where I grew up. I told him the basic details and kept my answers polite. He laughed often and said he appreciated talking to someone who seemed down to earth. When we reached the front of the store, he asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I hesitated for a moment, but then gave him my number because I thought he seemed harmless and friendly. I paid for my groceries and left. He called me on Tuesday evening as promised, and we agreed to meet at a small bar downtown that Friday night. I arrived a few minutes early and sat at a table near the window. Arnold showed up right on time and greeted me with a wide smile. He ordered us drinks without asking what I wanted, but I didn't comment on it. He leaned back in his chair and started talking about himself right away. He said he wasn't like other guys, and he valued respect and honesty more than anything. He also went on about how women usually misunderstood him. After about 10 minutes, I felt uncomfortable because he sounded rehearsed and forced. He kept calling himself kind and different. He also complained about his exes and how they never appreciated him. I finished my first drink and told him I didn't think it would work out. Most people would just ghost, but I was trying to be more forward at the time, so I said it outright. He seemed to take it all right, and he said he respected my honesty. He walked me to the door and said goodbye in a polite way. I went on with my weekend and didn't think much more about him. I expected he'd move on, and that would be it. But 2 days after our date, Arnold sent me a long text message. He said that I misunderstood him and that he was nervous when we met. He explained it in detail and said he only acted that way because he cared. I didn't respond. The next day, he sent another message that was even longer. He repeated that he was a good person and that I judged him too fast. He said he deserved another chance, but I still didn't reply and hoped he would stop. But the messages continued every day. Some were calm and others sounded slightly bitter. He went from apologizing to blaming me for not seeing his true character. I felt uncomfortable, but I stayed quiet because I thought ignoring him was the best option. Weeks later, my bank called while I was at work. The person said they flagged suspicious activity on my account. Someone had tried to open a new credit card in my name. The application used my correct address and full legal name. I asked how that could happen, since I hadn't applied for anything. The bank froze my account and told me to call the police. I left work early that day to take care of it. One of the cops interviewed me and asked a whole bunch of questions. He pried into my personal life trying to find out who could have done it. I told him about Arnold, and I also showed the text messages he sent me. A few days later, the police called me back. They said the IP address used for the credit card application traced back to Arnold's laptop. He was brought in for questioning, and he admitted that he used my information. He said he wasn't thinking clearly and felt rejected after I cut things off. He also confessed to searching through my social media pages for details. The police explained that he would be charged with identity fraud and harassment. They told me to keep any future messages as evidence. I blocked his number and changed all my online passwords that same evening. I also signed up for credit monitoring through my bank. Arnold received a sentence that included probation and a fine. He was also ordered to cease all contact with me. I never saw him again after that, but I still worry sometimes that he's going to do something. That hasn't happened yet though, and as far as I know, he's moved on. I started going to the gym in 2022 because my doctor said I needed to be more active and consistent. I chose a small place a few blocks from my apartment because it felt good and it stayed open late. The front desk was usually run by a college kid who wore the same gray hoodie every shift, and he never said much. The space itself smelled like disinfectant and old rubber, and the lighting was a little harsh but not unbearable. I went 3 or 4 nights a week after work and followed a simple routine that I found online. I kept to myself and wore headphones so nobody would think I wanted to talk. Even still, a guy noticed me during my first week there. He introduced himself and said his name was Brandon while I was adjusting the seat on a leg press machine. He said he went there almost every day and that he liked helping people who were new. He started giving me tips I hadn't asked for and corrected my posture more than I needed. I thanked him and figured he meant well, so I didn't make it a big issue. Over the next 2 months, he kept showing up whenever I did, and he always found a reason to be nearby. He'd comment on my form or ask how my day was, but I kept my answers short and put my headphones back on. He didn't pick up on the hint, but he also never crossed a clear line. He just lingered around wherever I was. Then one evening in late October, the weather was cold. I finished my workout at around 9 and put on my jacket as I headed for the exit. Brandon followed me out and said he wanted to walk me home to make sure I stayed safe. I told him I was fine and that my place wasn't far. He kept insisting and said he didn't mind. I said that I didn't want company and walked towards the sidewalk. He trailed behind me for a few seconds before stopping. I could feel him looking at me, so I didn't turn around. I stood on the corner and ordered an Uber because I didn't want him to see where I went. When the car pulled up, I got in and left without looking back. The next afternoon, I came home from work and noticed something under my welcome mat. It was a folded sheet of paper and a few printed photos. The pictures showed my apartment door from the hallway. The note said he just wanted to keep me safe, and that he'd been making sure nobody messed with my place. He signed his name at the bottom, like it was a normal favor. I stared at the pictures for a minute before going inside. I locked the door and set the note on my kitchen counter. I knew it wasn't normal, but I also felt uncomfortable treating it like a full-on emergency. I decided I'd deal with it if he pushed any further. That night, I heard a knock at my door, which was unusual. You had to get buzzed into the building, so if anyone came to see me, they wouldn't usually get to the door without calling. I checked the time on my phone and saw that it was just after 8. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. Brandon stood there holding his phone in one hand and tapping his foot against the hall carpet. He knocked again and called my name, but I stayed behind the door and told him to leave. He said he only wanted to talk and that I was overreacting. I repeated that I didn't want to and that he needed to go. He leaned closer to the door and tried the handle, even though it was locked. That was the point where I stopped hoping he'd calm down. I told him I was calling the police and that he was trespassing. I stepped back and dialed the non-emergency line. While I was waiting for the police, Brandon paced in front of my door and muttered to himself. He knocked one more time and yelled that I was being a bitch. 2 officers showed up within 15 minutes. They spoke to him in the hallway and asked why he was there. I could hear his voice through the door as he tried to justify everything. He said he cared about my safety and that he'd been watching out for me. The officers didn't look impressed and eventually told him to leave. When he refused, they put him in handcuffs and walked him out of the building. They took the note as evidence and asked some questions about his behavior at the gym. I explained the pattern and everything. Over the next few days, I stayed with a friend because I didn't feel comfortable sleeping alone. The police gave me an update later in the week and said they'd found something concerning. During the investigation, they discovered a small camera hidden in a bush across from my building. It had been angled toward my front door and the hallway entrance. They confirmed it had been placed there days before the note appeared. Brandon was charged with trespassing and illegal surveillance, and he pled guilty after his lawyer reviewed the evidence. The judge issued a no-contact order, and he wasn't allowed near me, my building, or my workplace. The gym manager also said Brandon was permanently banned, and that his membership had been terminated. This happened when I was 30, and I was working a steady office job in a dull gray building near downtown. I spent most of my evenings at home, scrolling on my phone, or watching whatever was on Netflix. I'd lost touch with most of my friends over the years, and I didn't make much effort to change that. My social circle had narrowed to a few coworkers, and my now fiancé Mark, who I'd started dating after we met through a mutual friend at a party. One night, I got a friend request on Facebook from a guy named Terry. I knew the name right away. We'd gone to the same high school, and he'd always hovered on the edge of my group, but never really fit in. He had been quiet, but intense, and he had a habit of staring when he thought no one noticed. I accepted the request out of curiosity, and he messaged me within minutes. He acted overly friendly, and reminded me of things that I barely remembered, like a class project and a homecoming dance that I went to with someone else. He suggested we meet for a drink since we lived in the same city now. I agreed because I felt a little nostalgic. Terry arrived early and already had 2 drinks lined up. He stood up and gave me a hug, then we sat down. It didn't take long before things got way too intense. He kept telling me he'd always cared about me and that he'd thought about me over the years. The way he said it made me uncomfortable, so I kept my answers short and neutral. He asked a lot of personal questions, and when I mentioned Mark, his expression changed for a second before he reset his face and forced a laugh. I finished my drink and told him I had an early morning, so I needed to leave. He walked me to my car and stood there watching until I drove off. After that, I avoided meeting up again, but I stayed polite through messages. He sent long texts about his life and his regrets, and I replied when I could without encouraging him. When Mark proposed, I posted a simple photo of the ring on Facebook. Terry sent one calm message saying he understood and that he wished me happiness, then he disappeared. I felt relieved, but I also pushed the entire interaction to the back of my mind and focused on planning the wedding. 2 weeks later, everything changed in a way I didn't expect. It was a morning like any other, and I walked out to the driveway with Mark. When we got to his car, I kissed him goodbye before he got in. I was halfway back to the house when I heard a sharp scrape and then a crash. I turned and saw his car roll forward into the edge of the low stone wall that bordered our front flower bed. The car stopped awkwardly at an angle, and Mark sat there confused for a second before getting out. He told me the brake pedal had dropped straight to the floor. He tried it again, and it barely responded. We both stood there looking at the front tire area, and I felt a sixth sense that something wasn't right. Mark called a mechanic and described what happened, and the mechanic said it sounded like a brake line issue. I suggested checking with our neighbor, Mrs. Latham, who had a security camera pointed directly at our driveway. Mrs. Latham was in her late 60s and always sat near her window with the TV on low volume. She let us in and led us to her small desk where the camera feed was stored. She pulled up the footage from the previous night and we leaned in as the video played. At around 1:47 a.m., a figure stepped into view and I could tell that it was Terry. He walked over and crouched beside Mark's tires. He wore a dark hoodie and gloves, and he stayed there long enough for his face to turn towards the camera more than once. We couldn't tell exactly what he was doing, but he seemed to have tampered with something. Mark swore under his breath, and Mrs. Latham looked horrified. We called the police, and an officer came to talk to us and copy the footage. I sat on the couch after they left and tried to calm down. Within a few days, they found Terry at his apartment on the other side of the city. He admitted everything during questioning and said he felt jealous and betrayed. The judge sentenced Terry to prison for tampering with a vehicle and for endangering Mark's life. Hearing those words in the courtroom felt like the closing of a heavy chapter I never asked for. After the trial, Mark and I went home and tried to get back to normal. We replaced the brake line and added better lighting around the driveway. Months passed and no further contact came from Terry or anyone tied to him.